Okay, we got a few more people joining, so I'm going to wait just one more minute.
Peter Wattson.
All right.
Hey. Looks like Tom Triplett.
It is.
I recognize you anywhere with your name at the bottom of the screen.
Long time, Peter. Good to see you.
Good to see you. Was it 1974?
How'd you remember that year?
Well, that was just a wild guess. Is that the right year?
Exactly right.
Okay. Well, good. I haven't lost it all then. Good to see you.
All right. Well, I'm hoping that people won't mind if they wait a little bit while we let them in. I'm going to get started. So thank you everyone for joining us tonight. This is an educational forum called Revisiting Redistricting, and it's hosted by the League of Women Voters of the White Bear Lake area. My name is Liz Lauder, and I am the current president of the League of Women Voters White Bear Lake area. The League of Women Voters has been around for 100 years because our work continues to be relevant. We work to educate voters on issues and candidates in a nonpartisan way so that people can make informed choices based on what matters to them most. The League is also active in all levels of government, giving our voices to advance public policy in many areas, especially in the area of voting rights. So we're very excited and pleased to welcome our guest tonight. Peter Wattson has been pursuing election law and redistricting reform for the last 30 years as a legal counsel to the Minnesota Senate for the National Conference of State Legislatures, in retirement, drafting legislation to create an independent redistricting commission in Minnesota, as an expert witness in lawsuits, and as a plaintiff in a lawsuit against Secretary of State Steve Simon. Joining Peter tonight in the role of facilitator is one of our League members, Lisa Larson. Lisa serves as our White Bear Lake area League Board of Directors as the Director of Program. She is an attorney and a former educator and a former House research analyst. Our program tonight will be approximately 60 minutes. And for those of you who are members of the White Bear Lake Area League, we ask that you stay on after the program so that we can take care of business at our annual meeting. The program is being recorded and will be available later to watch on our YouTube channel. And a link to that is on our website, which is www.lwv-wbla.org. I'm going to put that in the chat so that you can all go to that later. The forum is also being broadcast on suburban community channels. You can go to their Facebook page to see the broadcast dates and times. We've muted the audience members' microphones to avoid background noise disruptions and to keep the conversation moving along without interruption. If you have questions, we invite you to type them into the chat on the screen, and we'll get to as many questions as we can in the time allowed. So I'll turn it over now to Lisa, who will get us started.
Good evening, everyone. We're so pleased to sponsor this program. Peter Wattson is a true expert on the topic of redistricting. Not only is it inherently interesting, but it's absolutely timely, as this group knows. Peter has lots of information to share with us, and we invite you, as Liz mentioned, to raise questions via chat as he goes, and we will try to ask as many of them as we can. If there is time after Peter's presentation, Peter said that he's got examples of maps that he's been drawing, and I suspect even more so since the filing of his lawsuit. And he would be prepared to show us an example of the map drawing for this particular region, which I personally would be fascinated to see and also hear what an expert takes into account when trying to draw those lines. However, it all depends on how the conversation goes and how wrapped up we get in particular aspects of this very interesting topic. So now I'm going to turn it over to Peter, and I'm sure will have lots and lots to learn as a result of his conversation with us. Thanks, Peter.
Thank you, Lisa, and thanks, Liz, and the White Bear League of Women Voters for inviting me to one of my favorite subjects, Minnesota redistricting.
Yeah,
And
even though
try to share my screen here. Let's see whether this works. Can you all see just the first slide? The title?
We see the whole gallery of slides there, Peter.
Okay, so I got to stop and go back and try the same thing again. Did that work better?
Yes, that's
Okay.
perfect.
Excellent. So what I'm going to try to do tonight, in the time permitted, is to answer some of your basic questions about redistricting, the things that you always wanted to know, such as why do we redistrict? When will it happen? Who will draw the maps? How will they draw them? And how can you participate? And as Lisa and Liz indicated, I welcome your questions whenever they arise, because I do not want you to get lost. There's a lot to cover here. I'll try to skim over it at a level that everybody can understand. But if there's something that's confusing or opaque, please let me know and I'll try to elaborate on it. I'll begin with a couple of definitions of two terms that you probably have all heard and thought were maybe synonymous: reapportionment and redistricting, but they are not. And to help you distinguish between them, I have put these two little definitions up. And the reapportionment is what happens, for example, with the US House of Representatives every 10 years when we take a census and reassign seats in the House of Representatives among the 50 states. We do not change the state boundaries, we change the number of members per state. Redistricting, on the other hand, does involve redrawing those district boundaries. We keep the number of members per district the same, changing the district boundaries in order to equalize the population. So why do we redistrict? Well, the first reason is because of that reapportionment of congressional seats. You know, every 10 years we take a census, and the Constitution mandates the census for the express purpose of assigning seats in the House of Representatives among the states. And every decade, seats move. And this map shows what is currently projected based on the Census Bureau's population estimates for 2020 that were published in December. These will not be the final numbers. We'll find out the final numbers in another week or so. For example, if Minnesota loses a seat as is currently projected, we'll have to draw 7 districts. So even if populations hadn't shifted during the decade, we'd have to still draw a different number of districts. Likewise with California, if they lose a seat, or Texas, if they gain 1, 2, or 3 seats, they're going to have to redraw their congressional district boundaries because of reapportionment. But even in a state where there has been no change in the number of congressional districts, there may well have been a population shift within the state. In fact, it's virtual certainty. Important thing to know about numbers in redistricting. Normally, absolute numbers are less important than relative numbers. It doesn't necessarily matter what the new population of a House district is in Minnesota based on the census. The question is whether that new population shows growth in the district that is slower than average, in which case the area of the district will have to grow to take in more people, or if it's been growing faster than average, in which case it will have to shrink in area in order to take in fewer people to equalize the population. For example, we have Minnesota. This estimate from the Minnesota State Demographer shows the population shifts from 2010 to 2019. We're 9/10 of the way there. And the green shades are House districts that have gained population slower than the other districts. The dark green is 4% or more below average, below ideal. The light green are 1 to 4% below ideal. The white are ideal. On the other hand, the brown districts, what you see in the metropolitan areas, every metropolitan area except Duluth, we got Moorhead, St. Cloud, Mankato, and Rochester down here, you can't see it right now, have all gained population faster than the rest of the state. Those areas are going to have to shrink. Well, as the green areas move into the metro area because they're having to grow and take in more population, and the brown areas shrink in area because they're overpopulated, the white districts that border them are going to be affected also. So even though these districts currently have an ideal population, their boundaries are probably going to change because of the changing boundaries of the districts all around them. This causes friction, especially among incumbents. And it can cause friction among voters who see some of their favorite representatives no longer in their district.
Peter, if I might interrupt you for a
Yeah,
moment,
please.
In looking at the maps that you've got there, it would suggest that the population shifts indicate a growing concentration of people in urban areas. In Minnesota and in other places too, there is an urban-rural divide. When you talk about the changes that the population shifts seem to suggest, what happens with that urban-rural divide?
The next map, which I was about to show you, is going to show exactly what happens in the sense of a partisan change. I'm glad you asked that question. Let me show you a map. This shows the political geography of Minnesota in 2010, before the current districts were drawn. And it shows who won the precinct, whether it was a Republican or a Democrat who won the precinct in a House district. The yellow boundaries are the House districts. And what you can see is the population is kind of dappled all over the state. There's a mixture of red and blue precincts all over the state. True, there are concentrations of red precincts here in the central Minnesota and concentrations of blue up here, and especially in the metro area, but there's an awful lot of mixing as well. Remember the look of this map for a moment as we take a look at the map 10 years later. It ain't the same, is it? Because that great mixture of red and blue you saw all throughout here, it's gone. It's all red. If you set out to draw a Democratic district in central Minnesota, how are you going to do that? There's not a single precinct, let alone a whole district worth, that voted for a Democrat. You can't do it. Same thing up here. You're going to draw a Republican district up in the Arrowhead? No. The whole metro area, Minneapolis, St. Paul, the first and second tier suburbs, you're going to draw a Republican district here? There aren't any Republican precincts. Oh, here's one. Here's one. How are you going to draw a Republican district in that area? You can't. So where is the action going to occur? Right in here. All these areas where there is a mixture, there's going to be a fight over the districts. And you've read in the newspapers for the last many years about the changing character of the Twin Cities suburbs. And you see that in the results of each election every 2 years. And this is where the battle is going to be. Who cares how these districts are drawn? Politically, they're all going to be Democrat. Same thing with these. But these districts are going to determine the balance of power in the Minnesota legislature. Now, when's all this going to happen? You know, the census was taken a year ago, and you know that we don't have any results yet. They were supposed to have arrived in the form of the state totals by the end of December. Now they're expected by the end of next week. And the block populations to redraw the districts were supposed to have been here by the end of last month, but they're not going to be here now until maybe as early as mid-August. The deadline the Census Bureau has set is September 30th. And why is that? Well, I think most of you know why that is. It's a combination of two things. One is COVID-19. The Census Bureau took the census primarily online this decade, also by telephone, also by mail, but primarily online. But not everybody answered the census, and the plan was, as usual, to sometime in late April, May, send the Census Bureau workers out into the field to knock on the doors of people who had not responded. They're called non-response follow-up. But it was delayed because they couldn't be going out knocking on doors during the height of COVID. In addition to the COVID problems, the president decided he was going to try to exclude undocumented residents from the count. Well, that's not the way the Constitution is written, and the Supreme Court said you can't do that. Or almost said you can't do that. But they definitely said you cannot ask everyone if they are a citizen. It's not proper. Census Bureau don't want to do that. We're not going to do that. So that delayed things for a while. And then there was another lawsuit over his second attempt to use administrative records, IRS records, ICE records, Homeland Security records to identify people who are non-citizens. That was tied up in the courts and it never happened. The Bureau at first, when they decided that they're going to have to delay the count because of COVID, said we're going to have a delay of about 4 months. And they came up with a new schedule, which had the reapportionment counts not coming until I think it was the end of April. Well, the president realized he wasn't going to be in office, or he might not be in office when that happened. And how could he take his Sharpie to the reapportionment numbers if he wasn't the president anymore? So he said, we're going to move heaven and earth to get those numbers in by the end of December. And he put a lot of pressure on the Census Bureau to do that. And the Census Bureau put a lot of pressure on its field workers to get all that counting done. And it was a huge mess in courts with deadlines changing and so forth. Well, it didn't happen. It wasn't possible, humanly possible, to get the numbers done and be accurate by the end of December. And as you know, he wasn't there. And so he won't be using any Sharpies. So when we finally do get the numbers and the districts are drawn, what is the Minnesota timetable? Well, the first event in the timetable is completing the drawing of legislative and congressional districts, because we say we're going to draw those districts before we redraw precincts and wards. And we said several decades ago that ideally that would happen 25 weeks before the state primary, which this decade would be February 15th. Then there's a whole set of additional deadlines that follow from whenever the legislative and congressional districts are done. Highly likely that that date will be February 15th, because it's highly likely that the legislature won't do it any before then, and the court will issue its plans on that day. Candidates have to be a resident in their new districts by May 8th. They would like to know where the district lines are well before May 8th, if that's possible.
Peter, may I interrupt?
Yeah,
may I interrupt you? We
Please.
got a question about related to COVID, that a number of people in Minnesota died from COVID. And the question is, what impact will that have on the census count? And then I do have a follow-up question related to changing population counts.
It's another source of confusion. Another reason why it's going to be difficult to count, and why there may be questions, criticisms of the quality of the count. But the rule is, if they were counted and as alive on April 1, they're in the count. If they died on April 2 or after that, they are not part of the census from April 1. Because everything is tied to where were you on April 1.
And to kind of follow up on this whole question of population, you earlier talked about the impact of the count in terms of Minnesota's congressional seats. And you said the prediction, at least at this point, is that Minnesota will lose a congressional seat. How difficult is it to redraw a state's maps to accommodate, in this case, the loss of a congressional seat?
I'm glad you asked that, because as a technical matter, if you've got your database all set, it takes about an hour. As a political matter, they'll be fighting for months because people disagree where those lines ought to be. But I've done that. It took me an hour or so to draw a 7-district map. It's not that hard. And especially when you use my method, which is trying to draw congressional districts using whole cities. In fact, in February of 2020, I drew my very first map using whole cities because that's all the population information I had. And I managed to get it pretty equal, not down to the one person level, but pretty equal using whole cities. And I actually have an 8-district map using 2019 population estimates that comes pretty close to having whole cities and equal congressional districts. It doesn't take long. No, not as a mechanical matter. The political fighting over it will last as long as you let it.
Thank you.
So who will draw the maps? Looking across the United States, you see 2 different primary map drawers, legislatures and commissions. And legislatures currently are set to draw about 30 legislative districts in about 35 states. Well, I think it's exactly 35 states. And exactly 33 states, the legislature will draw congressional districts. But in about 15 states, no, it's exactly 15 states, the congressional districts will be drawn by commissions, or legislative districts will be drawn by a commission, and in 10 states, congressional districts will be drawn by a commission. There are additional commissions that will get involved, maybe. In 5 states, there are advisory commissions that will come up with a recommendation they will forward to the legislature under certain circumstances. And the legislature will decide whether to adopt them or not. And 4 who do that for Congress. There are another 5 states where if the legislature or the commission fails to do the job by a certain deadline, then a commission is called in to finish the job. 5 for legislative districts and 3 for congressional districts. But in addition to this assignment of primary responsibility, oh, by the way, you add up the 33 Congress and the 10 Congress done by commissions, that's 43, because there are 7 states under the current apportionment that have only 1 member of Congress. And if the projected apportionment happens, Montana will go from 1 to 2 and have to draw congressional districts for the first time, but Rhode Island will go from 2 to 1 and no longer have to draw congressional districts. But the courts get involved when both the legislature and the commission, if there is one, fail to get the job done. In this last decade, there were courts drawing plans in 4 states for both the legislature and Congress, and in 4 additional states for Congress only. So 8 did Congress, 4 did the legislature. It's also interesting, I think, that in the last 3 decades, there are 3 states that more than once had to have the courts draw plans. That's Minnesota, South Carolina, and New Mexico. 2 decades where they had to have the courts do it. Nobody other than Minnesota has had 3 decades where the courts had to draw the plans. And nobody, therefore, has had 4 and 5 decades, as Minnesota has, for having to have the courts draw the plans. We are way out there among the states as being a legislature that is incompetent to draw legislative and congressional plans. We just can't do it.
Peter of this.
We got lucky once in 91 when the governor was late with his veto.
Peter, if I might interrupt you, you've talked about Minnesota's experience, and currently, if I'm not mistaken, Minnesota is the one state with a divided legislature. To what extent do you think having a divided legislature plays into this outcome of having the courts draw the maps?
I will answer that in connection with these next two slides. Our Constitution says that the legislature is to draw the maps for both Congress and the legislature at its first session after each census. And until 1881, they did it. But since 1881, the only time the legislature has managed to enact a legislative plan at its first session after the census was 1991, when the governor failed to veto the map on time and it became law without his signature. And it would not have been a good law without the courts stepping in to fix up all the errors that were in the plan. So without help of the courts, we haven't done it at all. That's 140 years of failure. And we were about to make it 150 if the legislature doesn't get its act together in the next 6-8 months. Now, why does that happen? And why do we have this history of having the courts draw our plan? Because of the divided government that you mentioned. Minnesota has had divided government in every year since 1950 when it was necessary to be drawing a legislative or congressional plan. It's just worked out that way. And I've got some other slides that show the history. And sometimes in the decades of the 50s, 60s, 70s, there were times when one party controlled all three, but it was never in a redistricting year. So we've always had this problem. And so it's having divided government is nothing new for Minnesota. It's the norm, and especially in redistricting years. Is that good or bad? I don't know, but it sure means that the legislator doesn't get the job done. There are people who would say that we have benefited from having the courts draw our plans because they've tended to draw fair plans, and that the court has put some emphasis on drawing districts that are competitive. And so that is how it's possible to have the districts switch party control election after election after election. We just don't go a whole decade without a switch in control. And some people would say that's because our courts have been drawing fair plans. Did that answer your question?
Thank you.
Okay. So this year has been no exception. I got involved with the League of Women Voters and the Common Cause back in October of 2018, drawing a bill to create a commission to do the job, since it appeared that the legislature had some difficulty in the past. And so I worked on that. I lobbied the legislature. The House managed to pass a commission bill in 2019, which went nowhere because they did not follow my advice to pass a bill that Republicans could vote for. They thought it was good enough. Let's have a bill to create a commission that Democrats will love. We'll get it through the House. Yeah, but it's not going to get through the Senate. Oh, well. So anyway, it didn't go anywhere. That's just a way of explaining that I've been working on this commission issue for quite some time. My first commission bill was drafted in 2007. And I've been working on maps for some time and was trying to persuade the legislature in January of this year to get the job done. And I said, here's a map. In fact, here's a set of maps. Start with this. I've done the hard work of equalizing the populations. All you need to do is critique my work, jigger it up, and you'll have some maps. Start by talking to each other at the highest levels. Get your Senate and House caucus redistricting coordinators to talk to each other. No bite. Wouldn't talk to each other. Refused to talk to each other.
Peter, if I might ask you a question about this whole process. A commission to redraw maps is a position of the Minnesota League of Women Voters. And the league has advocated for such a commission for some time. What, in your opinion, is the likelihood that the legislature at some juncture, citing the inability to reach agreement that you've just mentioned, how likely is it that a commission, the idea of a commission might prevail? Or is this one of these quixotic undertakings, in your opinion?
I cannot currently imagine the circumstances that would persuade the legislature to want to do that. I don't see it in the cards. The states that have created commissions have mostly been states, not exclusively, but mostly been states that have the initiative, where the commission is created over the objection of the legislature. Now, there are a few like New York that have been able to create a commission without going through the initiative. Virginia did it recently. But I just don't see that happening in Minnesota under the current circumstances where people are so happy with the courts. I talked to 107 members of the legislature in 2019 and 2020 about creating a commission. Broad support. The number one preference, have the courts do it. I got most of them, a significant majority in both bodies and both parties to say yes. Well, if the courts won't do it, I think we could have a commission, and I made some progress on the content of the commission and how it would operate. But it was obvious for some reason they made their usual decision at the start of this session. They were not going to draw the plans. They would rather have the courts do it. So how did I get involved in Wattson versus Simon? You probably wanted to know. I'm talking to the members and I'm getting no support for the idea of creating a commission. I'm also getting no support for the idea of even talking to each other about agreeing on some maps. And I go to the barber on February 3rd, as I normally do. He's 30 miles away. I go to the Capitol barber. He's a great source of rumors. So we're talking about, well, what do you hear about? He says, Peter, I don't think either the House or the Senate has any intention of passing a redistricting plan this year. Oh, really? That's kind of the vibe I'm getting too. They're just not going to do it. I'm thinking, looking at the past, what has happened? Every January, Alan Weinblatt goes into court with a new group of plaintiffs and files a lawsuit saying the legislature is highly likely to not do their job. And if they don't do their job, the courts are going to have to do it. And I want to get a court panel appointed to do that just in case the legislature fails once again. Well, this is February. Where's the January lawsuit? Alan, what's going on? So I called Alan, old buddy of mine. And he says, Peter, I retired a couple of years ago. I'm not practicing law. Well, Alan, who's going to file a lawsuit then? Peter, you are. Alan, I'm not a courtroom lawyer. I'm not a trial attorney. I can't do that. Oh, Peter, no, you could be second chair. We'll get you a lawyer. We'll get you a trial lawyer. He can do all the explanations and you'll do the maps and you'll draw the pleadings. You know all the redistricting law. We'll get somebody for you and you can be right there. I don't know. So we talked more about it and called people see about interest. And I thought about, well, who would be our plaintiffs? And Alan at first said, well, I'll get you some plaintiffs. Well, we talked some more and we weren't coming up with any plaintiffs. And I'm thinking, if I were a plaintiff, I'd get to draw the maps. Because the first plaintiff is sort of the leader of the litigation. I get to draw maps. I love to draw maps. How can they tell me you can't submit a map if I'm the lead plaintiff in the first lawsuit? So I said, I'm going to do that. So I did. I called my relatives, my friends, and a friend of a friend of a relative, and got 5 other people to be plaintiffs, and we filed a lawsuit. Because it's the way it's done in Minnesota. Every decade, it's filed. And since Alan retired and he turned over the baton to me, I said, okay, I'll be the guy. But I'm not doing it next decade. I don't think. I'll be 86. Need to know anything more about that aspect? Because here we go with the timetable for the lawsuit. We filed a complaint and a petition to the Supreme Court asking them to take statewide jurisdiction of all redistricting cases dealing with Congress and the legislature, so that if a case was filed anywhere in any district court in the state, it would get sent to the same tribunal, one place for all the decisions. And the court, as usual, granted our petition in March, but as usual, did not appoint the panel. They said, we will wait and give the legislature every opportunity to draw a plan. Now, in past decades, at least the last five, last four, the court has waited until the legislature adjourned, and in June or July has appointed a panel. That wasn't the case in the first decade because we were in special session working on a legislative plan until the end of October in 1971, when the governor vetoed the plan passed by the Republican legislature. But in every other decade, they've been appointing the panel in the summertime. And if they follow their schedule from the last decade, they'll take public testimony sometime in October. Typically hearings, one in each of 8 congressional districts in the space of a week or 10 days, a very short timeline, two hearings a day, traveling from place to place, morning and evening or late afternoon. They will ask the parties for their recommendation on districting principles, sometime probably November, could be later. After the court then accepts those proposals and has an oral argument, they'll come down with an order that says the principles they're going to adopt for this decade, which will probably be about a lot like the ones for previous decades. And then they will set a date for the parties to submit plans, probably December, could be later, could be January.
Peter, if I might, may I interrupt you? Earlier, before the program actually began, we chatted a little bit about districting principles and priorities. And you said there's some tension in deciding about those principles and priorities, and whether changing demographics might influence at least the priorities with respect to principles. Can you tell us a little bit about that? What is it that you have to take into account? What kind of compromises might be necessary when you look at the various principles that you take into account when drawing boundaries?
Yes, I will talk about principles. Thanks for the lead in. On population equality, the court has always said that congressional districts should be perfectly mathematically equal, no more than one person different. I think that's crazy. A difference of 3 people doesn't really make any difference in the political behavior of a congressional district, even 10 or 50. And I think it would be better if they use whole precincts to draw their congressional districts, and as much as possible use whole counties and whole cities. They've always set a deviation, that is, how far above or below the ideal can any given precinct be, of 2%. 2% plus or minus is okay. There have been people proposing a smaller deviation, 1% or 0.5%, but those suggestions have been rejected. But I wouldn't mind a 1%. That's what the League and Common Cause are pushing for, 1% or even lower. That doesn't really come into conflict with much other than keeping the units whole. And what I've said is that my preference is to do more to keep units whole and less to have perfectly equal populations. And the balance that I am recommending for the court is a little bit, just a tiny bit more in favor of keeping those units whole. Use whole precincts rather than dividing precincts and getting down to one person for congressional districts. So that's one of the tensions that's going on. And of all of the things that you mentioned, I don't think I'm going to come across anything that changes because of the changing demographics that you're talking about. The one thing that's going to be really important because of the changing demographics is this minority representation. Minnesota in the past has one of the lowest minority populations of any state. Some decades ago, the total minority population was something like 4%. Well, it's significantly more than that. And exactly how much it is going to be for 2020, we won't know until sometime in August or September. But I'm suspecting it's significantly higher. And as I'll point out at the very end, that's going to have major impact on the Twin Cities suburbs. You know, from driving around and from news stories and whatnot, there are a lot more people of color in the Twin Cities suburbs now than there were 10 years ago. But we don't know exactly how many and where. I am working now to try to get some kind of estimate numbers to have some idea of that changing demographic of people of color. Because in many ways, it's the hardest thing in redistricting, to provide fair representation to members of minority populations, because you can't really determine what you need to do in the way of fairness without doing a mathematical examination of election results, which is expensive and time consuming. Convenient contiguous territory is a requirement of the Minnesota Constitution. Not dividing counties, cities, and towns. The language of the court in 1992, I think, picked up language that I had drafted for the legislature that listed counties, cities, and towns as the entities that should not be divided. But and that may have carried over into 2002. But in 2012, the court decided to drop that language in favor of the language in a statute that I drafted and was enacted in 1994, saying when you're inquiring what's the intention of the legislature, because a district boundary is ambiguous, presume that the legislature intends not to divide political subdivisions more than necessary to meet constitutional requirements. So the court just substituted that generic language that I had drafted for the more specific language that I had drafted later, in a later decade. Compact territory is a word that the court has always added to the principles, even though we have this constitutional language about convenient contiguous. The court has always put some effort into not dividing American Indian reservations. It's very hard not to divide any, because their territory may have some large chunks, but there are also many isolated parcels that are all over the place and many miles from the main reservation. So that's something that I am pushing. I don't know if that's a result of any changing demographic, although maybe it has something to do with the election of more indigenous officials to public office, our lieutenant governor and members of the Minnesota House. The court has always said, let's protect communities of interest. And that's the essay question in redistricting. It sort of is whatever you make up to justify the lines that have been drawn based on partisan political considerations. The court has put as its last principle that we will not draw districts that have the intent or effect to defeat incumbents. We will take a look at our maps after we have drawn them, and we'll jigger them slightly if necessary to avoid conflicts that can be relatively easily avoided. Some people have suggested the court should have a principle related to electoral competition, the bottom one. That was a push of Jesse Ventura in 2001. The court did not take him up on that. The Senate did, in its principles, include competitive districts. There may have been at one time support in the House. Drawing districts that don't favor or disfavor a political party, I'm not sure that we've really gotten into that much in Minnesota, but it's a big deal nationally. And there have been many states in the last decade, since 2010, that have added to their constitutional or statutory language a prohibition on favoring a political party. So that's a hot topic, and I'm going to encourage the court to get involved in that this time. I shouldn't go on too long about numbering the district, but it is a pet peeve of mine. Historically, from 1858 to 1972, the legislative districts were numbered consecutively, starting at the southeast, where the population of the state began. People first moved into the southeast, and then they moved north and west as the 19th century moved on. But in 1972, the court, first time it drew plans, decided it would skip the metro area and then come back and do the metro area later, and then do Minneapolis and St. Paul last. I think that had to do with the maps, paper maps they were using. No good reason for it anymore. And so I'm going to try to persuade the court to not skip the metro area. I don't know whether that'll be controversial. Anything more that I could say on principles that would address the question that you asked?
Peter, as always, you have so much information to share. It's quite wonderful. I actually do have a question, and maybe there is no answer to it, but having worked at the legislature, I know that by and large, there are only relatively speaking, a handful of districts, mostly suburban, that are truly competitive. And that in races, and in this partisan era, this seems to be even more so. In races, the problem or the challenge comes not from the other party, but from the more extreme wing of the party of the incumbent. And so to that extent, if that scenario is correct, there aren't that many competitive legislative seats in Minnesota. Is that something we should even worry about?
Yes, we should worry about it a lot and do what we can. We have a lot more competitive seats than most states. You can see the reason from the map that I showed you why we don't have more competitive districts. You're right on when you say it's the suburban districts that are competitive, and in the big scheme of things, it's a relatively small number. But that's where they can be competitive, and the court in the past has managed to make a number of districts competitive. They need not be competitive. If the legislature were drawing the map, there would not be as many competitive districts. But one reason for drawing competitive districts is that it encourages civic engagement. You saw why we can't do it. You saw where we can do it and where we should try to do it. And the reason we should try to do it is because of the civic engagement. The several lawsuits challenging legislative and congressional plans as partisan gerrymanders, which began to be successful in 2016 and beyond for the very first time, had evidence that where the districts were not competitive, what happened was that voters lost interest. They didn't vote. Candidates lost interest. They didn't want to run. Candidates have trouble raising money. People didn't want to contribute. Why should I give money to this candidate? They're going to lose anyway. It's not a close race. So when you don't have candidates who are interested, you don't have people who want to pay for them, and you don't have people willing to take the trouble to go out and vote because the race isn't close, participation falls off. And these lawsuits show that happening in state after state, in Wisconsin and Ohio and Michigan and Maryland, where the first election after the redistricting was relatively competitive, and the second and third elections, people just lost interest. The heck with it. But we should do what we can, I think.
Well, the league is all about civic engagement, so you certainly have our ears.
Okay. I'm running out of time here. We got, what, 10 minutes or so to go?
Yes.
9 minutes to go. There's no way I'm going to get through all of it. Have you all seen this diagram before, so I don't need to explain it?
I believe we have. We did look at the whole issue of redistricting about a year ago. So it was an interesting undertaking, but not nearly as immediate or as charged as it is right now.
Okay. Well, I'll assume that you know that it all depends on how you draw the lines. And you can be uninspired and just draw your lines vertically and have 60 blue and 40 red, exactly the same as the population as a whole. Or you can go horizontally and have blue win all the districts, or be more creative and have red win 3 out of the 5. You got choices, and you can be creative and you can do tricky things with it, as legislatures do. I do want to, if I only get in this one remaining point, I think we'll get in more, but wouldn't it be nice if the party that got the most votes got the most seats? And I happened upon a couple of sentences from Chief Justice Earl Warren from the very first case that said that state Senate districts had to be equal population, that the US Senate was not a model that they could follow. He said, you will probably remember, legislators represent people, not trees or acres, right? He said, logically, in a society ostensibly grounded on representative government, it would seem reasonable that a majority of the people of a state could elect a majority of that state's legislators. Since the legislatures are responsible for enacting laws by which all citizens are to be governed, they should be bodies which are collectively responsive to the popular will. What a beautiful sentiment. Wouldn't it be nice if that were the law? And if more states adopted the prohibition on partisan gerrymandering, that would be true more often. But Wisconsin is an example of how you can win more seats without winning more votes. In 2018, and roughly the same thing happened in 2020, Democrats won every statewide race. And they won a significant majority of the state popular vote, 54 to 46. That's a pretty good win. But they didn't win a majority of seats in the legislature. With 54% of the vote, they only got 36% of the seats. The Republicans, with 46% of the vote, got 64% of the seats. That is exactly what the Republican legislature intended by drawing the partisan gerrymander that they did in 2011, which was thrown out by a federal court in 2018 and reinstated by Chief Justice Roberts and the US Supreme Court in 2019. Wouldn't it be nice if the party that won the most votes got the most seats in the legislature? I think I'm going to have to skip some of this. All this, it's so much fun. Let's see, we got 6 minutes. Y'all know packing and cracking and kidnapping and pairing?
I think, I don't want to speak for everyone, but I think we do.
Okay, so here's packing blacks, Republicans in the North Carolina legislature. Here's cracking Democrats. And you can see how you do that by going through a Republican area here and sneaking by the Democratic precincts, and over here get more Republicans and elect a Republican in what's basically a Democratic area. That's why the districts looks the way they do. Same thing here with what the Maryland Democrats did to Republicans. They cracked them. And what the Illinois Democrats did to Republicans, they cracked them. Pairing, putting 2 members into the same district, which happens here in 2011. Marcy Kaptur and Dennis Kucinich put in the same district. He is also kidnapped. He's paired, but is also kidnapped because he is put into a district where most of his new constituents are strangers. They're not in his database. He's going to lose, and he did. Minnesota's done the same thing. I won't bore you with that, but you can see they're packed in here. The metro is packed in here. And these other 1, 2, 3, 4 other districts extend into the metro area so that rural populations can elect the congressman in 1971, 5-3. So we have these principles in order to stop that kind of thing from happening. And in Pennsylvania, the Supreme Court, just by imposing 2 principles: 1, districts should be compact, and 2, districts should avoid dividing counties and cities and towns where possible, produced a district that looks like this. It looks better, And if you analyze it politically by taking a look at the underlying map, you see that this district west of Philadelphia in the suburbs is primarily Democrats here, with a few Republicans thrown in, and it elected a Democrat. And as a result of just those two principles, compactness and preserving political subdivisions, they flipped 3 of the 18 seats, making the congressional representation 9 and 9, with a statewide vote evenly divided, as it had been in this swing state for several elections, evenly divided, but it had been 12 to 6 in the previous elections. So those two principles can be really important, and that's why the Republicans who control the Pennsylvania legislature are now pushing a constitutional amendment to elect the Supreme Court from districts drawn by the legislature so that they can gerrymander the court. In North Carolina, they gave us the case that allowed Chief Justice Roberts to say the federal government has no jurisdiction over partisan gerrymandering. No limited and precise standards in the US Constitution. Look at state statutes. He says states have been doing a marvelous job over the previous decades in prohibiting this kind of thing, which we think is not a good thing. It's not a good thing. It's just there are no standards in the US Constitution against it. Let the states do it. When you analyze a district like this, which is that same 12th congressional district that was drawn in 92 and it looked about the same in 2012, it had to be redrawn because it was found to be a racial gerrymander. And so the legislature redrew it saying, oh, no, it's not a racial gerrymander. It's a partisan gerrymander, and that's not illegal. Okay. And you wouldn't know it was a partisan gerrymander just by looking at it. It's compact. This is Mecklenburg County here. The district fits within one county. It's all nice and solid. But is that a partisan gerrymander? How do you know? You don't know by looking at it. When the drafters are skillful, you need to do a mathematical analysis of the vote in order to see that it is a partisan gerrymander, where these are the Republican districts where their winning majority between the line here is relatively modest but consistent. Whereas for the Democrats, they have 3 seats they can win easily with 65 to 70% of the vote. This S curve is called the signature of gerrymandering. But you only see that with statistical analysis, which is time consuming and expensive. But after the US Supreme Court said, let the states do it, it took North Carolina only 4 months to do it, to have a suit filed in state court. And this congressional suit was not filed until September 27th, I think it was, about 3 months after the decision from Justice Roberts. They filed their lawsuit, and in a month, they had the congressional districts on their way to being thrown out. Now, the court was very astute here, telling the legislature, we think we're going to throw out your districts. You might want to redraw them on your own, because otherwise, if you wait for us to throw them out and draw them, the time is going to be too late. So the court did it. But they relied on the same analysis, statistical analysis, that the federal courts had used to throw out the congressional districts in North Carolina, which Roberts had said was no longer good law. So Peter, it can be done. State courts can do it. And here's what the legislature did. Here's our friendly 12th district in Mecklenburg County. They followed the court's advice and did not divide as many counties and cities, and they have districts that are compact, and they flipped this from being a 10-3 Republican majority to being an 8-5 Republican majority, which was not exactly fair, because in this 2020 election, Democrats actually got more votes statewide. And they should have won 6 or 7 of the 13 seats, but at least they won 5. Anyway.
Peter, I hope you'll forgive me. I feel absolutely terrible about this, because you have so much knowledge and we can learn so much from you. Unfortunately, our schedule is such, because it's an annual meeting, that we have only 1 hour for this program. Maybe you'd consider an invitation from us at a future date to finish this or maybe talk about after the fact what we learned. I know our president, Liz Louder, has a few comments to make, including thanking you on behalf of us all for your presentation. Please do forgive me. I'm so terribly sorry. We're the losers for having to break off the program at this juncture.
I would be happy to return to some other event where we can talk about maps.
Yeah, Peter, I want to be able to see the map that you've drawn.
I've run a minute or two over my time.
Right. Well, we're very grateful to Peter Wattson for coming tonight and showing us all these great maps and things. I think this talk should be required viewing by everybody in the Minnesota State Legislature. To know that we've failed in the last 140 years to draw decent maps, I think would shame them into creating an independent commission. But, you know, I can only hope. So this has been a great learning experience. I really do want to have Peter back at some point because I want to see the maps that he's drawn and see how they might compare with anything that the legislature or the courts would come up with. So thank you again, Peter. We're just been really pleased with how this has gone, and you're a great speaker, and we love to hear from you. Thanks to everyone for joining us tonight. I want our local league members to stay with us because we will be doing our annual meeting. And so if we're going to take a break for a few minutes, but I want the members for the White Bear Lake Area League to stay with us. So thanks again. And for the rest of you, please enjoy your evening, and thanks very much for coming.
Thank you. Have a great meeting.
Thank you so much, Peter.